Alright, so we've created our Geo in World Machine, and say this is what we're happy with, and we export it out of World Machine as an OBJ and import it inside of Max. Now it's a little bit heavy, it's not the highest resolution mesh that you can export, and we did that purposely because the machine will die. So we've kept it relatively smaller, and we're gonna downsize it even more to get a less dense mesh, less polys, and then we'll bring back some detail with displacement. So first we're setting up our camera in our viewport, and we'll create a camera from view. So now this will be our shot cam, and we'll start to pro-optimize this Geo to get it a little lower. So let's lock our camera so we can't mess up our view since we're happy with it. Now you'll see that we'll keep using the same piece of Geo and we'll duplicate it around to get more out of it than we originally planned. Just because when you rotate a little bit slightly, you can see as I'm doing here, you can get various mountains without actually going and recreating them. We could have gone into World Machine and created separate pieces, but this works just fine, and we don't get the sense of repetition at all, which is important. We don't want it to look like it's been duplicated and cloned everywhere. You definitely want to pay attention to that. And we're just going to change the colors around so we can see each piece. It's good, and it'll help you visually identify different pieces in your scene. Now here we go. We're looking for the modifier Pro Optimizer. We're going to throw it in. We're going to press calculate first, so it's going to calculate the amount of polys that the piece has, and then in that vertex percentage we're going to really go down to about 50% and then 10%. I've cut it so that you didn't have to wait to see that thing processing, because it takes a little while on my machine, but we've really brought down the size. And again, for distance stuff, we don't need all that high-res detail. Maybe in the foreground we'll keep it, but for the distance we're not going to need it. That's why we knocked it down. And we're assigning the different pieces to different layers so that when we freeze it, our viewport will be faster. Don't ask me why, but that's just the case inside of Max. So you can see we froze the foreground piece, might work on the background one, and then we'll freeze the foreground, or the background will work on the foreground one. So layer, naming your layers, keep it nice and clean, organized, so you know. This helps tremendously when you have a ton of stuff in your scene. Not so much here because we only have a few pieces, but still good habit to form. So we can move it around, and I like to move it with the transform window there open, the box there, and that way I can see it through my shot cam and get the view that I want. I can see rotating it around again, trying to avoid the sense of repetition and cloneness, and get a layering effect of these mountains to really, when we start putting an atmosphere, to have it feel deep and vast. So this is similar to if you were painting, you bring in another reference photo, if you're doing a map painting, and you put it back there and you color correct it and push it back in with atmosphere. This is basically doing that job for us here in 3D, so that we get all the lighting for free, atmosphere for free, and it's just all going to look beautiful and seamless. So duplicate it again, see if we can create some more complexity. Throw Pro Optimizer again, and because it's further back, we'll put it just to 1%. This is going to be really hazed out. We're not going to see any detail whatsoever, and it's good to have photo reference up of the kind of lighting that you want, or the atmosphere that you want in your scene, so that you can make these decisions in 3D. So you're not going super high res on every single little piece of geo and then find out that the ones in the back are getting a ton of atmosphere and you can't see any detail whatsoever. So part of the planning process before you jump into this, find some reference photos and plan out your shot, the amount of atmosphere, the kind of lighting. This is a backlit situation again, so it gives us a lot of leeway with the amount of detail some of these mountain features need to have. So here we're just continuing to block in the scene. Let's go into our render setup and set up a render V-Ray Advanced. We're going to turn on our GI settings, but we'll wait first to start creating some lighting before we jump into the render settings. We're going to create a V-Ray light. It's going to be a plain light or an area light. And this will act as our key light, essentially the sun in our shot. And you can change the dimensions. The bigger the light and the further away it is, the more diffuse we're going to get our shadows, and the smaller the light, we're going to get that nice sharp shadows. Because it's backlit, we're going to get pretty much what we want, and this has already been planned, is rim light just hitting some of these forms, cutting them out from each other, and illuminating the atmosphere so that we get some nice separation and depth in our scene. So, of course, nothing appears. We haven't added a dome light for fill. We'll turn on GI as well and change the multiplier to 50. And you can see it starts to cut out the forms like the rim light that we were talking about earlier. We want the lighting here we don't want it all to be backlit with no lighting whatsoever. You get a really nice edge lighting, really helps to create a dynamic image, more realistic, and to help you cut out the shapes and add depth to your shot. So first we're going to warm up our light to make it the same colors you would expect to see in a sunset lighting condition. And again, you always have some reference up, and you're not making these decisions, haphazardly. You're always looking at something to guide you, the right color, the right value, the right look. And that's where reference gathering is very important. Always look for reference. So we're going to create some materials here that we can apply to the mountains, and they're going to be V-Ray material. And we're just going to apply a gray shader for now to see how the lighting is reacting with this V-Ray shader, and then we'll make some better decisions as we go along. It's a step-by-step process. It's not a kind of plug it in and it works right away. You have to work at it to get it the way you want. It's never going to be perfect from the first render. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth adjustments, trial and error. So let's turn on GI, and for the primary bounce we're going to use the irradiance map, and for our tests we're going to set it to low right now so we get faster renders. And for the secondary bounce we're going to use light cache, and you want to lower your subdivs because that's the sampling, and we set it to 200. It's pretty low It's not going to be the highest sample rate, but for quick renders, this is what we want. And this is what we get with that lighting that we have. So you can see the gray is really bright, almost like snow. So we're going to darken it to a color that these mountains could possibly be. Again, we're just looking for lighting at this point. And we want to set that material and that local color of that mountain to be something similar to the final texture that we'll be using, and see how it reacts in that lighting condition. So we're going to create another light here. I'm going to set it to our dome light. This is going to act as our fill light and fill in all our shadows, and it's going to be at a very low multiplier because we don't want it to be strong. This is going to act as the sky essentially. So we're going to create a cooler color to fill in those shadows, and we don't want it to be too bright, and they could always be adjusted again in Photoshop. We're planning to paint on top of this, so it's definitely adjustable. And there you see the fill light affecting the render. The shadows are cooler. Rename it so we know what light is what, always staying organized. We can play around with different colors too, shift it around again based on your reference. Take a look at what that fill color is and play around until you get a similar look out of your render. Maybe increase the intensity, decrease it depending on the look that you want based on your reference. You can really make those decisions and save yourself a lot of headaches later on in the painting process. You turn off the background one so we could take a look at this foreground piece for now. And we're going to apply a UV map modifier to use the maps that we rendered out from World Machine and use it on top of these. And if you remember from the World Machine files, they're top down, so you want to change the alignment to your y-axis. It's going to be mapped straight down. So that's where you saw that alignment getting changed to Y. And then in a minute, we'll jump into loading our maps up. I'm going to go in our shader here. And in the diffuse, we're going to plug in a composite layer. And what this does, it allows to add a texture or bitmap in this case, and an alpha. So we're going to pick our tileable forest texture. Make sure it's tileable because it's going to be tiled, and you see it right there. And this is going to serve as the vegetation on our mountains. So we can tile it so that we have the right scale on top of mountains. Scale, very important, because it's going to drive and tell the viewer how big these mountains really are. And then in the alpha section there, we're going to tell it where to put this vegetation. And it's one of the slope renders that we rendered out from World Machine, and it dictates where it's going to show up on that model depending on the slope that we modified. So if we want it on the tops and not so much near the bottoms, we can adjust that slope until we're happy with it. We can add another layer, and this is why the composite layers option is very powerful. And we create a rock texture, another tileable rock texture, breaking down our texture into two different things, vegetation and rock. And you can see there how it's being applied with the slope map. We get some nice transitions as well. And we're just going to go into enable the color map here, see if we can push and pull that mask and see if we can get it showing up a little tighter. Felt like it was feeling a little too bright, the texture. And we can go in and adjust that slope alpha as well. If we wanted to make it tighter or fade out more, we can do that as well. This is just affecting the color, so we don't have to go into Photoshop and adjust our rock texture again. We can do it right there in the shader. Darkening down again. The trees and the rock texture. We'll see in a minute how this turns out. But this is the great thing about using these composite shaders. You can add tons and tons of layers as long as we have the alphas that we got out of World Machine. We can keep adding more and more layers for different parts of this, and it's just really powerful tool. And the advantage of going through World Machine is that we get those alphas and maps for free, as you'll see later, a little bit later on, how we control them. So here we're doing another color map using the Bezier corner, so we can adjust this curve here a little bit better. And we want to adjust that alpha like we talked about a little earlier and make it a little higher contrast. So we really make those clean separations and separate out exactly where the vegetation and rock start and stop. Before it was a little too, there's a lot of mid values causing a almost fading into each other, which we don't want, because that wouldn't happen in real life. You press render and we see what the effect of that is. And we're going to select a render region here just so we can play around with this and see if we can get the look that we're after with this. Adjusting the curve until we're happy with it. Again, the texturing is not going to be 100%. This is just a base. We're going to be painting on top of this, so it doesn't have to look photoreal right out of the box here. Even with our adjustments, we're not looking for a photoreal render. We're looking for something that's good enough to paint on. So render to see how it looked. Let's take a look at the background stuff. Apply the shader. They can all be the same because they're all part of the same geological area, so they will all have a similar look. And because we rotated around and moved around, it's not going to be too identical. But first they need the UV map. Again, choosing the y-axis, and we press fit there so it encompasses the entire geometry. Same thing for the other ones. We could have done this before and then duplicated them around, but in this situation we forgot, so we'll just do it anyway. It's pretty quick and painless. So all our mountains here loaded up. Now to get that extra little bit of detail, we're going to throw a V-Ray displacement modifier on it. And that's going to add a little bit of, a lot of detail. And we want to load a map basically into this. And what we're using is a rock map, because the rock map has a lot of kind of ins and out values to create a just visual noise inside of it. And that's what's going to really drive the look and the realism of these things. And we're going to get some nice spec hits off of them and really add to the look of it. So we've tiled it and we've thrown that inside of the V-Ray modifier there in the text map. And now the amount is going to control how much displacement there is on it. Right now it's set to 2, but if we need more, we can get more. You see a little bit of detailing there on the edges, the ins and outs there. We see it mostly where light's going to hit it. So as light hits those forms, we catch a little bit more detail. It's not so much. It's not going to happen so much in the shadow side. It's going to happen more in the lit faces. That's where the light catches those faces and kind of gives you all that detail. So you can see the difference between displacement there, and if we check it in the global parameters there, and we'll see the difference. You see it just going, changing the shape also of the mountain to give it a little bit more of a natural feel. Sometimes what you get out of terrain builders like World Machine or View is really this procedural, and you can see it here in the viewport as this really spiky look. It's not very natural, but that little bit of displacement changes the shape of it just enough to get it to look a little bit more natural. And we'll apply the same V-Ray displacement mod and grab the map, the diffuse map that we created it in, and instance it over. The reason it's in that shader is just you need a place to create it, almost like a palette, and then drag it over. That's why it's in there. So we've applied it to the closer mountains. We don't really necessarily need it on the further mountains because, again, it's going to be filled with so much atmosphere. It's just going to add more render time for nothing, really, with no added benefits. So we even separate out our lights so we can freeze them or unfreeze them and get them out of the scene if we need to. Or if we need to quick select them, it's right there. We can also hit the H key, but I like to keep everything organized so we have our lights in our layer system. And we'll use the same techniques here on a lot of production shots to get something realistic. Now, lighting goes a long way in realistic painting. So if we can get the lighting for free, and that's why the textures aren't going to be photoreal, but if we get the lighting and the atmosphere for free from 3D, that's already 85% of our job done because it's set in reality. All we'll have to do is push and pull and add some texture to make it look photoreal. So, and that's what we're really aiming for here. And we'll use the same techniques on production shots to produce really high quality work. So just adjusting the lighting again, very important. You know, take your time with this step because it is that important. You can turn off displacement too to get faster renders so that you're not bogged down with displacement. And here is where the big chunky piece of this shot's going to come from is the environment fog. And that's just a V-Ray environment fog, as you see right there added. And the first thing we change is the fog color. And we want to set it to something, again, looking at a reference and pulling from there the right color and the right look for it is going to be very important. And again, we'll go back and forth and adjust this if we need to, but looking at a reference and pulling information out of there, we'll set our color initially and adjust it accordingly if we need to. We'll see how that looks like first, and we can start adjusting things. The subdivs are the sampling, so the higher the samples, the lower, the higher the render times, and the prettier it's going to look. But to save render time, you can see the noise in the render right now. We're not concerned about the noise. We can always bump up the subdivs. What we're looking for is the fog distance, which determines how far that fog goes. And as you see, we cranked it up to 1,000. It's going to be a trial and error. Go back and forth and see how these things look. And you see, just changing around gives you a totally different look. So again, it's going to be a trial and error process until you get the look that you're going for. Let's increase it and see how that affects it. Basically, what we're looking for is less fog in the foreground and heavier in the background. So as it comes in the foreground, we're going to have less fog, higher contrast, and as it goes further into depth, we're going to have heavier fog, lower contrast, less detail. So we cranked up our subdivs there to 32 to see, and we click there, optimize atmospheric evaluation for faster render, and then we increase that global subdivs multiplier just as a general upping of the sample quality. You're going to get a lot prettier image with less noise in it just by bumping that global subdivs. And you can see right here, a lot less noise. There's still noise in the shadow area, and that might be through our dome light, but for the most part, we see the fog working there. And going into our render elements, we can add a V-Ray atmosphere to separate out that fog, to be able to control it inside of Photoshop. We created a V-Ray light select also to separate out that lighting in case we need to push and pull it. And we just selected that light there. You see V-Ray Light 01. And then we'll add another one. These are going to be our render layers to help us paint. V-Ray Z-Depth. That's going to be very, very handy to control atmosphere, even control fog. Very powerful passes there. We'll use the V-Ray frame buffer to render it out. Let's see what our render gives us now. Just cut to the final render here. So we have our RGB color here, and you click on the sRGB, which is very important. It'll bring it to view in sRGB space. So we have our alpha, these are our render layers, our light select, which is just our key light, because that's what we selected, and then our Z-depth, which is going to give us a lot of control in the painting. You can see there that we forgot to turn off the visibility in the plane, in the light, sorry. So we have a plane in the background there. And to save control, we can save out TIFF 16-bit. And for the override, you put 2.2 to get it into sRGB space. Otherwise, you'll get a linear render out like an EXR. And those are all saved out. And you see there that we forgot to turn off our light there, visibility in our light. And that's not what we want. RGB color is there. We'll turn off our fog and render. Sometimes what we do is render a version with fog and without fog, depending on how we want to be able to control it. Since V-Ray fog and atmospheres is on a separate layer, we can always add it back in. Rename it, rename all our passes. So I render out and save out all our passes again with that light turned off now. 2.2. We'll save it. And we're done there for our passes. So once we save it out, you can see our alpha, RGB, Z depth, and our light select all set up there. And we'll take these passes and we'll begin our painting process in Photoshop and show you guys how we use all these passes to create the final painting. So we'll jump into the Photoshop section and really dive into how to use these passes. Here it is in Photoshop. We can open up these passes here and have them all ready to paint on.